I'll now invite Grantlee Kieza to give the 2024 Sir Albert Coates Oration.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me here tonight to speak about a couple of remarkable Australians in Vivian Bullwinkle and Albert Coates. Truly great Australians. This is a very great honour for me as I've come back to my hometown, the place where my mother and I were born and where my parents met way back in 1950. Thank you also very much for the hospitality shown to me and my wife Colleen. It's a privilege to share with you the story of the extraordinary Vivian Bullwinkle, a great Australian and a shining example to everyone of resilience and love for her fellow human beings. My book, Sister Viv, is the story of a fearless Australian nurse and her 64 colleagues who endured all manner of horrors during World War II. And it's also the biography of the lone survivor of one of the most despicable war crimes perpetuated against Australians during that war, and how Vivian not only survived a massacre, but dedicated the rest of her life to the memory of those who didn't. Vivian had the same sort of spirit as Albert Coates, who we are also honouring this evening. Like Coates, she was a person whose life was built around self-sacrifice and service to others. Tonight, I want to explore with you the courage and humanity of both Vivian Bullwinkle and Albert Coates, who did so much to save lives during their own ordeals in World War II. Almost 80 years after the end of that war, they still shine as examples of humanity, kindness and strength. And events such as the Coates Oration are crucial for preserving their memory and promoting their example of self-sacrifice to a new generation. Tonight also provides the opportunity to honour the three Ballarat nurses, Clarice Halligan, Beth Cuthbertson and Kath Noyce, who died in the massacre on Banker Island while serving their country. Vivian and Albert Coates knew each other and worked together in a hospital in Singapore before the Japanese invasion. And in fact, it was Coates who was among the first to raise the alarm about the massacre of the nurses at a place called Banker Island off Sumatra in February 1942. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. My family has a connection with Ballarat going back almost 200 years. In the 1850s, my ancestor, Robert Ramage, the poor son of a stonebreaker who lived in the shadow of Stirling Castle in Scotland, set sail from Glasgow for the goldfields of Ballarat. This is my great-grandfather's family, and the tall man on the top left is my grandfather, Jim Ramage, on the day before he sailed to fight on the Western Front in 1917. When I was a small boy, I would walk around the streets of Ballarat and he would take me out to the side of the Eureka Stockade with him, and it was him who first introduced me to a great love of history and the importance of preserving Australian history. Jim actually sailed on a troop ship called the Ballarat, which was torpedoed in the English Channel. All the Australians on board managed to survive, but not all managed to survive the conflict that followed in Belgium and France. Jim was one of the lucky ones. He returned to Australia, married my grandmother Alma, and built a dairy farm at the far end of Humphrey Street, where I spent my first 4 years of life in the 1960s. And I still have some wonderful family members living in this beautiful golden city. And like Albert Coates, my brother attended Mount Pleasant School. My mother, Gloria Ramage, met my father, Adam Kieza, at a church dance in Ballarat in 1950. My father was part of the large Polish migration to Ballarat after World War II. Sadly, my dad passed away in August, only a few weeks short of what would have been his 100th birthday. But he had a fascinating life. He survived years in Nazi slave labour camps, and at the end of the war, when he was liberated, he joined the Polish Guards, an attachment to the American occupation force. One of the places my father was stationed was the former concentration camp at Dachau near Munich, which the Americans had turned into a prison to hold many of the high-ranking Germans for the war crimes trials in both Dachau and at Nuremberg. I had a long career as a journalist with the various Australian newspapers and as a television sports commentator, but over the last dozen years or so, I've written a number of big biographies of people who had a large impact on Australian history. And I felt that these stories were vital for Australians to know. They include the great aviator Bert Hinkler, the botanist Joseph Banks, who was the great driver of European settlement of Australia, Hudson Fysh, the founder of Qantas, the great poet and short story writer Banjo Paterson, and the navigator Matthew Flinders, amongst others. And my latest book tells the story of John and Elizabeth Gould, who were English bird experts who came to Australia in a great voyage in the 1830s to document and draw in magnificent, lush detail the astonishing bird life and the unique mammal life in this country. And they also sounded a warning that we had to protect our unique fauna lest it be gone forever. And I feel that we have to protect our history in this country lest it be gone forever too. And that's one of the main drivers for writing these books. But of all the books I've written, and there's been about 25 of them until now, the story of Vivian Bullwinkle is certainly the most powerful and emotional. Writing it at times, I became quite teary when documenting the courage she and her fellow nurses displayed in dealing with the horrific circumstances they faced. This book is the account of one woman's remarkable life, but it's also a lesson about resilience, about courage, about determination, which I think is so important in today's day and age. Like the life of Sir Albert Coates, the life of Vivian Bullwinkle serves as a beacon to inspire all of us to realise our inner strength that we can call on to face any obstacle in life. And just like Vivian Bullwinkle and Albert Coates, we can find the resilience within us to never give up. With all the books I've written, I've often received enormous help from family members of my subjects who provided me with rare personal insights into the character I'm writing about. In many cases, they've given me memorabilia, documents, correspondence, and that really helps me to draw out the life of these characters. This was especially true when it came to writing about Vivian Bullwinkle. Her closest relative, her nephew John Bullwinkle, a wonderful chap who lives in the Southern Highlands south of Sydney, opened up his home to me very generously and provided me with a window into Vivian's mind and soul, which few people had ever been given access to. Vivian's collection started with the scrapbooks and photo albums she had kept since she was a young girl growing up at Broken Hill in Western New South Wales, all the way to correspondence she received just before she passed away from people who had endured similar horrors to her at the hands of the Japanese almost 60 years earlier. I've had a number of people help me with my books. This man, his name is Alistair Campbell. His great-grandfather was a chap named Banjo Paterson, and he wrote such poems as Waltzing Matilda and The Man from Snowy River. Alistair is a farmer in New South Wales, a grazier. I thought it was extremely ironic that the great-grandson of Banjo Paterson lives on Henry Lawson Drive in the New South Wales town of Young. This is a lady who helped me very much with my books. Her name is Wendy Miles. Her father, Hudson Fysh, was a war hero in the Great War, World War I. He returned in 1919 without a job. He thought he might go rabbit trapping for a while, but he had learned to fly in Egypt, and he and his mate Paul McGuinness were able to raise enough money to buy 2 second-hand rickety biplanes. They started an aerial taxi service for graziers on the vast stations in Western Queensland and the Northern Territory. They called it the Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Service, but they later changed it to just the initials, which was Qantas. Michael Bennett, the great-grandson of John Monash, was also very helpful when I wrote the book about Australia's great World War I commander. And this lady on the left, with some of her relatives in England, she is the descendant of a man named Matthew Flinders, who not only mapped the whole outline of the Australian coastline and proved it was a continent, but he also gave Australia its name. And she was very, very helpful to me with information about the Matthew Flinders and his family. This is John Bullwinkle and Vivian not long before she passed away. It was because of John that I was able to provide readers with a never-before-seen look into Vivian's story and her inspiring life of dedication to the nursing profession. My book, Sister Viv, it's the inspiring story of a nursing hero who survived a wartime massacre and dedicated her life to saving others. Vivian was an ordinary person thrust into extraordinary situations. She survived a bullet wound in the back and 3 years of torture at the hands of her captors. When she came back to Australia, she became a pillar of the Australian nursing community. One of her great motivations was to honour the nurses who she served with in World War II, but who did not return. Among them were three of Vivian's friends from Ballarat. One of them was Beth Cuthbertson, who was born in Stirling, South Australia. Beth attended Ballarat High School and trained as a nurse at Ballarat Base Hospital. She was engaged to a doctor when he died suddenly in 1938. Beth was living in Ballarat when she enlisted with the Australian Army Nursing Service before embarking for Singapore in July 1941. This is Clarice Halligan. She was born in Ballarat in 1904. She trained in Melbourne and served for some years as a missionary in New Guinea. She enlisted in the Australian Army Nursing Service at the Australian Army Medical Corps Depot in Melbourne in July 1940. And this is Kathleen Kath Noyce, who was born in Mollingip near Ballarat in 1911. Another of the people who helped me in writing the book Sister Viv was Kathleen's great-nephew Michael Noyce. He's a lawyer and a winemaker in the Hunter Valley region of New South Wales, and the brother of the Hollywood film director Phil Noyce, who has made movies such as Patriot Games and Rabbit Proof Fence, and who has worked with actors such as Meryl Streep, Harrison Ford, Denzel Washington, Michael Caine, and Nicole Kidman. Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Bullwinkle was an extraordinary woman. She really was. She was humble, generous. She had an unbreakable spirit and fortitude. She was the sole survivor of a horrendous war crime on Banker Island in 1942. But more than that, Vivian was dedicated to all people. She was a true leader, an honourable person and very dignified, a true humanitarian. In the course of writing the book, I interviewed a lot of people who knew Vivian, who worked with her at Fairfield in Melbourne, and they were just in awe of her as a person, her courage, her spirit, her dignity, the steps she took to improve the profession of nursing and to really lift the educational standards for nursing and to make it a profession all of its own, not just as assistants to doctors. The story of Vivian starts with the marriage of her parents, George Bullwinkle and Eva Shegog, in Adelaide in 1914. George was an Englishman and the descendant of a German man named Johann Bullwinkle, who opened a pub in London and became a wine merchant. George came to Australia to work as a jackaroo in the late 1800s, and he then found a clerical job in the mines of Broken Hill, which for some time was the richest city in Australia. Eva was the daughter of a South Australian country policeman who came to Australia from the Victorian goldfields. Eva's father was stationed at a place called Kapunda in the Barossa Valley north of Adelaide, and Eva travelled there from Broken Hill to have her daughter Vivian in 1915. A son, John Bullwinkle Sr., followed a few years later, and John became a Spitfire pilot in World War II. Broken Hill was once one of the most prosperous places in Australia, but by 1920, when Vivian was 5 years old, it was riven with industrial action, and the Bullwinkle family suffered from a lack of funds brought on by all the mining strikes that were occurring there. George and Eva decided it would be better if Vivian lived with her grandparents for a while, now that they were retired in Adelaide. And this is Vivian about the age of 5 or 6 with her grandparents in the Adelaide suburbs. So she spent most of her primary school years living with William and Emily Shegog in the Adelaide suburbs and attending primary school there. It's probably here in Adelaide where Vivian's spirit of self-sacrifice and duty to others was fostered. As William Shegog had been a highly decorated mounted policeman in his younger days, with frequent citations and even newspaper accounts of his bravery in trying to rescue others. Vivian had basically a happy childhood in a large extended family which loved her very much. These are photographs all from Vivian's own album, which she left to her nephew John Bullwinkle. That's her with her mother Eva and with her grandfather William Shegog, the retired mounted policeman. By the time Vivian reached her high school years, she had returned to Broken Hill. She's the tall girl on the left in the photo behind me. She was the star player in the school's basketball and tennis teams. She'd actually hoped to make a career in sports, but sports didn't pay all that much in the 1930s. Not even Don Bradman could make a real living out of being a sports star. She hoped she might make it as a sports mistress, but in Broken Hill there were not all that many opportunities for her. So her mother suggested that she go into nursing, as it seemed like a safe profession. Little did she know what was in store for her daughter. So Vivian began training at the Broken Hill Hospital as a trainee nurse in the early 1930s. She made many friends at Broken Hill, and she eventually took to the nursing profession. She was an extremely popular young nurse, even though at first she wasn't particularly attuned to the profession. She didn't really like nursing that much when she started. She didn't like all the personal things she had to do. She didn't like all the private bits she had to become involved with. She didn't like all the smells. She didn't like all the bodily fluids that she had to deal with. But gradually, she grew to really embrace nursing, and she had a real calling for it. She became very well respected for her diligence and for her concern for others. Some of the friends she made at Broken Hill in the 1930s were still her friends 60 years later. At the outbreak of World War II, Viv's brother John Bullwinkle volunteered to train as a fighter pilot, and Viv decided to join many of her nursing friends in volunteering for the Australian Army Nursing Service. On the 9th of September 1941, Viv was aboard a ship called the Wanganella as it sailed from Fremantle out into the Indian Ocean with its full complement of 216 personnel of the 13th Australian General Hospital. It was bound for Singapore. Albert Coates was already in Malacca, Malaysia with the 210th. In the first few months of the war in Singapore and Malaysia, there wasn't a great deal for the nurses to do except treat tropical diseases amongst the Australian servicemen who were stationed there to ward off the feared threat of a Japanese invasion. Many of the nurses spent their time helping local people, and this is Kath Noyce with a Malaysian villager in the closing days of 1941. She and so many of the other nurses only had a few weeks to live. For Viv and many of the other nurses, those balmy days were almost like an exotic holiday. They were in a beautiful part of the world. There were no battles. They got to go to flash restaurants, diplomatic parties, dinner dances. They went to beautiful night spots for dinners at Raffles Hotel in Singapore. And this is Viv enjoying a cuppa with her mentor, matron Irene Drummond, who has the glasses. Irene Drummond had also been Viv's boss at Broken Hill Hospital, and Viv was really her protégé. So the end of 1941 was quite an idyllic time for Viv and the other nurses in Singapore and Malaya. But then, bang. In a cyclonic wave, the Japanese twin-engine bombers made simultaneous attacks on various targets in the Pacific, including Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, where they wrecked the American fleet stationed there, and then other targets in Malaysia as they began a sweep south towards New Guinea and Australia. When the Japanese reached Singapore, Viv and the others witnessed scenes of carnage that were worse than their worst nightmares. Children being blown to pieces, mothers being cut down by machine gun fire, fires all around what was a beautiful city. This was in February 1942, and the Australian High Command by this time had become well aware that the Japanese were using rape as a weapon of war. They ordered all the Australian nurses to evacuate Singapore immediately, and though Viv and the others were heartbroken to leave wounded Australian servicemen to the merciless invading forces, they did as they were ordered. The Australians fled Singapore on a variety of vessels. Some made it to safety back in Australia, most of them didn't. Viv and 64 of her colleagues were ordered to board a small cargo ship called the Vina Brook. It normally carried 12 passengers in luxury, when it was sometimes used as the Royal Yacht of Sarawak. But it now carried 300 desperate men, women and children escaping the ravenous Japanese wolves snapping at their heels. The scenes at the dock as the ship left were horrific, with people fighting to get on board, stepping over dead bodies for what they thought would be a berth to safety. The captain sailed for Batavia, which is now known as Jakarta, because that was not yet under Japanese control, and it was thought it would be a safe haven on the first step towards freedom in Australia. But the Viner Brook was only 2 days into the voyage to Batavia on the 14th of February 1942 when the nurses looked into the sky and saw 9 small dots getting closer, and they could hear the buzzing as well. The 9 dots turned out to be Japanese bombers with orders to destroy everything they saw not bearing a Japanese flag. This is not the Viner Brook, but this is the sort of carnage that Viv and the other nurses witnessed as the Japanese unleashed hell on them. The bombers literally blew the small ship out of the water as 300 people, including Viv and many babies and children, were hurled into the sea. Many of them could not swim. Some people were killed by the bombs, some by machine gun fire from the attack aircraft, some by the burns they suffered in the attack. Others drowned. Some, including Viv, managed to make it to life rafts or clung desperately to pieces of debris as the planes came back to machine gun them again. One of the Australian nurses who couldn't swim was Olive Paschke, a very popular matron who worked with Albert Coates in Malacca. That's Olive on the left. However, some of her nurses, including Carolyn Ennis, that's her on the right, managed to drag Olive onto a life raft. They also managed to scoop up some of the floundering children who were floating by and drag them to safety. Unfortunately, in war as in life, so much of what happens to us is decided by chance. And while Viv, her boss Irene Drummond, and the 3 Ballarat nurses and others drifted towards land, the raft carrying Olive Paschke and Carolyn Ennis and the children they rescued caught a different current, and it drifted further out to sea. None of their friends or family ever saw them again. And I have to say, when I was writing these passages and these accounts of what happened to some of these nurses, I genuinely became very, very teary. It's so emotional what these people went through. And their whole mission in going to Singapore and Malaysia was to save lives. 12 of the Australian nurses died in the water that day, but 53 of the 65 who'd boarded the ship washed up here on Bangka Island off Sumatra. They washed up at different times and different places. Some, such as Viv's friend Betty Jeffrey, were in the water for 3 days when they finally reached land. Viv was naturally overjoyed to have reached the safety of a beach after the ordeal in the water, and she was with a group of 22 Australian nurses and some British servicemen. They were at a place called Raji Beach, and they thought that local villagers there would be able to give them food and water. Sadly for Viv and the others, they had arrived on Raji Beach at the same time as the invading Japanese army. Vivian, the 3 Ballarat nurses and the others were confronted by the Japanese, who then separated the men from the women. If I could just read you a little extract from my book about what happened next. The shocking roar of gunfire sent a blast of adrenaline fear through Vivian Bullwinkle. As flocks of birds burst from their jungle hiding places, the young woman's gaze darted towards where, beyond a headland about 100 metres away, Japanese soldiers had marched 2 groups of prisoners, about 25 of them, many of them badly wounded British soldiers and sailors. Viv's face devolved into a mask of shock and dread. In the 2 months since Japanese fighter planes had obliterated the pride of America's naval strength in their lightning attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had unleashed hell as its armed forces surged south in their conquest of Malaya, their sophisticated, heavily armed bombers opening the way for their small, rapid tanks and well-trained, ruthless fighting men to destroy anything and anyone in their path. Now, just after 10 a.m. on the 16th of February 1942, under the cruel gaze of Japanese captors, Viv, 21 of her nursing comrades, and an elderly British woman whose husband was dying were assembled on the beach, too terrified to move. Their captors were a brutal detachment of Japan's 229th Regiment, who only a few weeks earlier had raped and murdered their way through the hospital that had been St Stephen's College in Hong Kong, leaving a trail of mutilated corpses on Christmas Day. Huddled together, the Australian nurses told each other to be brave no matter what. But their hearts sank when the Japanese soldiers returned from the headland without any of their prisoners. As they walked in single file behind their captain, Arita Masaru, a small, intense young officer with a neatly cut uniform and a sword by his side, the soldiers were laughing. When they reached the captive women, they began to wipe blood from their bayonets with rags. Viv was a brave, tough girl who had grown up in the hard-scrabble world of Broken Hill and had spent years giving comfort to the sick and the dying. A young woman who had mended broken bones and shattered hearts as a nurse in a mining centre and then on the front line of a fiendish war. Now, after spending so many years saving lives, she and her comrades knew for sure that their own lives were about to end thousands of miles from the warm embrace of home. Many badly wounded men and women were lying on stretchers nearby. What would the Japanese do with them? Viv watched frozen as Japanese soldiers set up a machine gun beneath picture-perfect palm trees fringing the beach. Then they ordered Viv and the others to walk towards the water. Matron Drummond called out to the girls, "Chin up, girls, I love you all," and then the murdering began. All the women were shot in the back by machine gun fire. Viv said she felt like she'd been hit by a baseball bat. She fell into the sea as the water all around her turned red with the blood of her friends. And Viv used to tell the nurses who worked with her at Fairfield Hospital that it was just an extraordinary thing that the water all around her had gone deep red with all her friends floating by. Somehow, Viv did not die. She was not sure how long she stayed in the water, but she eventually realised that the Japanese had packed up their machine gun and left. As the bodies of her friends floated all around her, she began to drag herself back onto the beach. The photo on the right here is particularly poignant. I mean, this is a beautiful, beautiful beach, idyllic island. But on the photo on the right, all those women were killed during the hostilities. The only one that survived was Mavis Hannah, who's sitting at the bottom of the left, and she only survived because she washed up in a different part of Banker Island. They were all from a unit called the 24th Clearing Station, and Mavis, who was Viv's friend for 50 years after this, she was the only one that remained of all those wonderful women. The Japanese machine gun bullet had torn straight through Viv, missing her vital organs. She staggered ashore, crawled and stumbled up the narrow stretch of sand, and then collapsed into some jungle undergrowth lining the beach. Later, she would guess that the reason she was not killed was that she was taller than all the other nurses. And when the machine gun bullets sprayed them all in the back, most were hit through the heart and lungs, but she was hit just above the hip. Vivian drifted in and out of consciousness for a day or two while hiding in the jungle, and then she came upon a man who had also been left for dead by the Japanese, but was somehow still alive after several bayonet wounds. Captain Masaru and his men were butchers, but not very good ones. And from the massacre on the beach, Vivian, 2 British servicemen, and an American civilian somehow survived badly wounded. Vivian cared for an Englishman named Cecil Kinsley for a week or so in the jungle, until starving, they made the decision to surrender to a Japanese officer, believing that not all the Japanese soldiers were heartless killers. And so for the next 3.5 years, Vivian was a prisoner of the Japanese on Banker Island and then Sumatra. From the 65 nurses who had fled Singapore on the Viner Brook, there were now only 32 left. 33 were dead. For many of those taken prisoner by the Japanese, though, it would have been less painful for them if they had been shot dead on the beach, because for the next 3.5 years they endured absolute hell. They were forced to bow to the Japanese captors, If they didn't, they were cruelly beaten or made to stand for hours in the sun until they collapsed. They were starved and denied medical treatment. They endured painful operations without anaesthetic. And yet their spirit remained strong, and Vivian was at the forefront of encouraging the others to fight on. All the time in the camp, Vivian had to hide her bullet wound because if the Japanese knew she had escaped a massacre, she would have been killed immediately as a witness to a war crime. Albert Coates had been working with the nurses in the last chaotic days in Singapore, and after his capture in Sumatra, he talked to a Japanese officer who alluded to the massacre and tried to excuse the killings that had followed. And gradually more and more news would filter to Australia that there'd been a massacre of the nurses on Raji Beach. Death lurked all around for the nurses who were prisoners of the Japanese. Death from disease, starvation, and bad treatment. They were imprisoned with hundreds of civilian women and children. After 3 years of horrific treatment, the Australian nurses were organising multiple funerals every day. And one of the really heartbreaking things for me writing this book was that 8 of those beautiful young women who had gone to the front line to save lives, who then endured years of torture and starvation, fell at the final hurdle. 8 of the nurses died while prisoners in the camps. There's 3 of them there. One of them was the feisty, hard-working Blanche Hempstead. She died on the 19th of March, 1945, a victim of malnutrition and beriberi. She told a friend sitting with her that she was sorry for all the trouble her sickness had caused for the others, and she apologised for taking so long to die. Here are 3 of the others who died after those 3 years of brutality in the camps: Wyn Davis, Shirley Gardam and Dot Freeman. After the war officially ended in August 1945, the 24 nurses who were still alive were at a remote camp on Sumatra, and they heard rumours that they had been taken there to be killed so that the Japanese could hide what they had done. But finally, the British Marines liberated them, and the Australian government sent a rescue party to bring the girls home. And this is just such an emotional part of the book. You know, one of the nurses, Jessie Simon, she honestly thought that they were all going to be murdered in the wilds of Sumatra and burned. And when the Marines arrived to liberate them, she said she just sat under a rubber tree and just cried for half an hour, that finally, after all that, she was going home. But when they were released, this is the kind of condition that they were in. That's Pat Gunther on the left and Jess Doyle. Now this photo was taken in a Singapore hospital a week after medical treatment and good food. So you can imagine what they looked like a week earlier when the Australian rescue mission was mounted to bring them out of Sumatra. They were so sick and emaciated when the rescue mission arrived that most were not expected to live beyond a few more days. This is Pat Blake. The rescue mission actually had photographs of all the missing nurses, but they thought they were in the wrong place because none of the nurses actually looked like the photos anymore. They'd suffered so much during the war. Vivian made it home to Australia for a very relieved mother, Eva. She'd endured 3.5 years of hell herself. Her son John had been shot down and nearly killed in a Spitfire crash over the Middle East, and her daughter had been missing for 3.5 years in the clutches of people who had a reputation for being totally merciless. Vivian made it her mission after she came back to Australia to visit all the relatives of the nurses who had been killed, to console them and to give them messages that their daughters did not die in vain. She also travelled back to Japan to give evidence here at the Tokyo war crimes trials. And it was an extremely traumatic time for her to go back to Japan after what she'd suffered. She'd suffered a great deal of post-traumatic shock over the war, and she still harboured a great deal of resentment towards the Japanese for the way that she and the others had been treated, and especially the loss of the life of those nurses in the camps who were more or less tortured to death for 3 years. But Vivian had an enormous heart as well, enormous empathy for other people, and she saw the devastation that the atomic bomb had caused in Hiroshima, and she realised that many of the Japanese people were also victims of the war, a war that they did not want either. Vivian went on to have a very long career as a nurse, and she became matron at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital in the 1950s. She ushered in a whole new era for Australian nursing, improving training methods, boosting educational qualifications, because she saw nurses as professionals in their own right and not just as assistants to doctors. She really became a pillar of the Australian nursing community and very much revered, not just for her war service, but what she did for the medical profession in the years after the war and what she did to help so many other people with their lives. But she was still not done with war. On a cold Sunday night in early April 1975, 30 years after World War II had ended, Viv was settled into an easy chair in front of the large log fire in her matron's apartment at Fairfield Hospital, her chihuahua Tao curled up at her feet. On the television was yet another news bulletin about the chaos of the war in Vietnam. Viv found the images of screaming women and children and homes on fire very unsettling. She had seen enough of that in the fall of Singapore. It was 10 p.m. when the telephone rang. Something about the late hour and the disturbance to her quiet time unnerved her. Viv answered the call, but she could hardly believe her ears. 30 years after she had come home from World War II, she was now being asked to go back to another war. In fact, Viv was invited to take part in the second Australian mission of Operation Baby Lift, the name given to the mass evacuation of babies and children from South Vietnam. On this mission, 75 orphans, all under the age of 10 years, most of them babies and toddlers, were being brought out of Saigon and brought to Australia to find new homes from the orphanage there. Viv led a team of nurses to Bangkok on a chartered Qantas flight and then flew to Saigon on an RAAF Hercules aircraft. Saigon was ringed by Viet Cong at the time, blasting away in scenes that reminded Viv of the fall of Singapore. Looking down at the war-torn countryside of the Mekong Delta below, Viv's heart raced. The inside of the RAAF Hercules was Spartan and as hot as a sauna. The engines on the aircraft were so loud no one could hear each other speak. Most of the interior space was stacked floor to ceiling with packing cases containing food and medical supplies for the orphans. As the Hercules rolled to a stop, the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, and reminded of Raji Beach, Viv shuddered. But the babies were waiting for them at Saigon Airport. They were put into rows of cardboard cartons on the Hercules. They were all very, very sick. Most of them had glaring signs of malnourishment, a condition which Viv knew only too well. They had all kinds of diseases too, tuberculosis, worms, other sorts of parasitic conditions, scabies, boils, abscesses, infections caused by lice and by poor nutrition and hygiene. Some had chicken pox and whooping cough. Some had respiratory infections, and all were suffering from fear and trauma. And Viv knew all about that too. Once in Bangkok, the children were loaded onto the Qantas jet, after which the plane took off into the dark night sky, bound for Melbourne. Many of the children and babies relaxed and fell asleep. Some, though, were ravenous, gulping down the food they were offered and looking for more. The children were all victims of hunger, trauma and starvation. And even the little toddlers had learned to fight for survival. The children gobbled down their food and some hid handfuls of rice under their seats for later use. Viv had a great sense of humour. She recounted that when one of the nurses bent down to pick up some of the rice, she received a karate chop to the back of the neck from an infant warning her to stay away. All of the children from Vietnam who made it to Australia were adopted into new families, and Viv remained in touch with many of them for the rest of their lives. Viv remained friends with all the women she suffered beside her in the Japanese prison camps. Women such as Wilma Oram, that's the lady on the left there with Viv, and Betty Jeffrey. And this is Viv and many of the nurses from the Vina Brook who appeared on the Channel 7 program This Is Your Life in the late 1970s, which paid tribute to Viv and her decades of service to Australia. Viv married a widower named Lieutenant Colonel Frank Statham at about this time. Not long before her passing, Viv and some of the surviving nurses, now in their 80s, visited Raji Beach to unveil a memorial to all those heroic women who did not return. I mentioned a little earlier that Viv was the only one of the nurses to survive the massacre, but there were a couple of men who also survived the horrors that the Japanese threw at them. Two of the men who were left for dead on the same day that Viv was shot were a British sailor named Ernest Lloyd, that's him on the left, and a big burly American adventurer named Eric German. And one of the treasures that John Bullwinkle kindly shared with me was a letter that Viv received in 1998, not long before her death. It was from Eric German, who nearly died with her 56 years earlier. He wrote, "Speaking of shades of Christmases past, here is one of a February day of many years ago, and the ones which followed come to visit you. I am Eric H. German, an American, 85, a widower and retiree, living in South Florida now, but at one time a fellow passenger with you aboard the Viner Brook, and a near lost soul companion afterward on that miserable Banker Beach. Blessed with the longevity given us, there must be few of our companions left anywhere anymore, and more, it seems, are leaving us yearly. So I believe it time to finally reintroduce myself and also congratulate you for your survivability, the estimable dedication to your profession all these years, and I wish you a few more additional golden years. We have taken rather diverse routes for our lives since those days, often pragmatically, suppressing the worst memories of them, just to face the everyday ordeals of daily living. 2 years ago, Viv became the first woman to be honoured with a statue at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and John Bullwinkle spoke at the unveiling, describing his aunt as an ordinary Australian possessed of extraordinary courage, fortitude and dedication to duty. It's an absolutely marvellous statue. Has anyone here been to see it in Canberra? It's an absolutely lovely statue, isn't it? It's a wonderful thing that pays tribute to Vivian and all the other nurses who suffered at Banker Island on that awful day on the 16th of February 1942. And I was down at the POW Memorial this morning with Don, and what a marvellous memorial that is to all the POWs who suffered, and the service that they gave for Australia. So tonight we also pay tribute to those Australians such as Vivian and Albert Coates, who in their suffering did so much to help the Australian people and made such sacrifices for the Australian people. More than 80 years after she was shot in the back and left for dead on Banker Island, as all her friends around her were murdered, Vivian still lives on as an enduring symbol of courage, resilience and love for her fellow human beings. And once again, thank you very much everyone for inviting me here tonight.